The rifle barrel pressed cold against Ezra McKinnon's temple as he knelt beside the dying wolf, his weathered hand still bloody from trying to stanch the animal's wounds. The December wind cut through the Kansas prairie like a blade, carrying with it the metallic scent of fresh blood and something else, something that made his stomach turn with recognition. "You should have minded your own business, McKinnon," came the gravelly voice behind him. Sheriff Caldwell's boots crunched in the frozen grass as he stepped closer, and Ezra could hear the man's labored breathing, the wheeze that had gotten worse since the consumption started eating away at his lungs. Some secrets are meant to stay buried in the dueling line. The wounded wolf's yellow eyes fixed on Ezra's face, and in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that transcended the barrier between man and beast. The animal's breathing was shallow, its silver-gray fur matted with blood that had already begun to freeze in the bitter cold, but there was a fierce intelligence in its gaze that reminded Ezra painfully of Sarah. His wife had always possessed that same unwavering determination, that same refusal to back down when she believed something was right. 2 hours earlier, Ezra had been splitting wood behind his farmhouse when he first saw the wolf stumbling across his property. The animal moved with a strange, purposeful gait despite its obvious injuries, leaving a crimson trail in the snow that led from the direction of the old Pemberton ranch. Something about the creature's behavior struck him as unnatural, almost deliberate, as if it were trying to lead him somewhere specific. Against every instinct honed by 45 years of frontier living, Ezra had set down his axe and followed the blood trail. The path wound through abandoned cornfields where unharvested stalks stood like skeletal sentinels, then across the frozen creek bed where he and Sarah used to walk on summer evenings before the fever took her. The wolf had paused there, turning to look back at him with those unsettling yellow eyes, waiting until he caught up before continuing toward the place locals whispered about but rarely visited. The dueling line had earned its name decades ago when the first settlers arrived in this part of Kansas. It was a natural clearing surrounded by blackjack oaks, their twisted branches creating an amphitheater where men settled disputes with powder and shot. The unwritten rules were simple: grievances that couldn't be resolved by law or reason were brought here at dawn, witnessed only by the trees and the crows that nested in their branches. Most men walked away with their honor intact and their opponent's blood on their conscience. Some didn't walk away at all. But as Ezra followed the wounded wolf into that cursed clearing, he discovered that the dueling line held secrets far darker than simple matters of honor. Scattered around the perimeter, partially hidden by decades of fallen leaves and prairie grass, were objects that made his blood run cold. A woman's bone hairpin, its ivory surface stained brown with age. A child's wooden toy soldier, one arm snapped off and lost to time. A brass locket that he recognized immediately because he had given it to Sarah on their wedding day 15 years ago. The wolf collapsed near the center of the clearing, its strength finally failing, and Ezra rushed to its side without thinking. As he knelt in the frozen earth, trying to assess the animal's injuries, his fingers brushed against something hard buried in the shallow soil. He pulled away dead leaves and loose dirt, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a leather-bound journal, its cover darkened by weather and time. The first page he opened made his hands shake so violently he nearly dropped the book. Sarah's familiar handwriting filled the yellowed paper, but the words she had written there spoke of horrors he never could have imagined. She had discovered something about the prominent families of their community, something that involved the dueling line and disappearances that went back generations. The journal detailed her growing suspicion that the clearing was being used not just for honorable combat, but as a dumping ground for inconvenient truths and the people who threatened to expose them. According to Sarah's meticulous notes, she had begun investigating after hearing whispers from other women in town about husbands and sons who had supposedly left to seek their fortunes elsewhere, but whose departure seemed suspiciously convenient for certain powerful men. The banker Morrison's business rival had vanished just before a crucial land deal. The preacher's son had disappeared after questioning irregularities in the church's finances. A traveling merchant who had been asking too many questions about local mining rights had simply never been seen again. Sarah's final entry was dated just 3 days before her death, and it revealed that she had arranged to meet someone at the dueling line, someone who claimed to have proof of what was really happening in their supposedly peaceful community. She wrote of her fear but also her determination to expose the truth, even if it meant risking her own safety. The last line sent a chill through Ezra's bones: "If something happens to me, they will try to make it look like an accident, but Ezra will know better. He always said I was too curious for my own good." The wolf whimpered softly, drawing Ezra's attention back to the present danger. The animal's wounds were deep but not necessarily fatal if treated properly, but more importantly, they didn't appear to be the result of a hunting accident or territorial fight with other wolves. The cuts were too clean, too deliberate, inflicted by something with a keen edge rather than tooth or claw. Someone had hurt this creature intentionally, and Ezra suspected it was because the wolf had witnessed something it shouldn't have. As he worked to clean the animal's wounds with water from his canteen, Ezra found himself remembering the details of Sarah's death with new and terrible clarity. She had been found at the bottom of Willow Creek Ravine, her neck broken in what everyone assumed was a riding accident. The horse had returned home without her, its flanks lathered with sweat and its eyes wild with panic. The town doctor, old Dr. Henley, had pronounced it a tragic mishap, the sort of thing that happened when experienced riders got careless on familiar trails. But now, reading Sarah's journal and seeing the fear in her own handwriting, Ezra began to question everything. Why had she been riding toward the dueling line that day when she told him she was going to visit her sister in the next county? Why hadn't she mentioned her investigation to him, her own husband who would have supported her quest for truth? And most disturbing of all, why had Dr. Henley been so quick to declare her death accidental when he usually spent hours examining even minor injuries with scientific precision? The sound of approaching horses broke through his dark thoughts, and Ezra quickly stuffed Sarah's journal inside his coat. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their faces grim and their hands resting on their sidearms. He recognized them immediately: Sheriff Caldwell, Deputy Barnes, and Judge Harrison's eldest son, Marcus. All 3 men had been among the most vocal in discouraging any further investigation into Sarah's death, insisting that dwelling on tragedy would only cause more pain for everyone involved. Sheriff Caldwell dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate in the way of a man who had seen too much violence and participated in more than his share. His badge caught the weak winter sunlight, but there was nothing reassuring about his presence here in this cursed place. The sheriff's pale blue eyes swept over the scene, taking in the wounded wolf, the disturbed earth where Ezra had found the journal, and the other artifacts still partially hidden among the fallen leaves. "Funny thing about wolves," Caldwell said conversationally, as if he were discussing the weather rather than holding a gun to a man's head. "They're pack animals by nature, but sometimes you'll find one that's been cast out, forced to wander alone until it dies or finds a new territory. This old boy here looks like he's been wandering for quite some time, picking up all sorts of interesting scents along the way." Deputy Barnes, a nervous young man barely out of his teens, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Sheriff, maybe we should just take McKinnon back to town, let him cool off in a cell until he comes to his senses. Lot of folks still remember how grief can make a man do strange things." But Marcus Harrison laughed, a sound devoid of humor that echoed strangely in the clearing. He was a man in his 30s who had never worked a day in his life but somehow always had money for the finest clothes and the fastest horses. His soft hands and pale complexion marked him as someone who preferred to let others do his dirty work, but there was a cruelty in his dark eyes that suggested he was capable of violence when circumstances required it. "Oh, I don't think McKinnon's going anywhere," Marcus said, dismounting with theatrical flourish. "Seems to me he's been asking the same sort of questions his dear departed wife was fond of asking. Some people just don't know when to leave well enough alone." The wolf's breathing had grown more labored, but its eyes remained fixed on Ezra's face with that same unsettling intelligence. In its gaze, he saw not just pain and approaching death, but something that looked almost like expectation, as if the animal were waiting for him to understand something crucial. The creature's wounds were beginning to clot, and Ezra realized that with proper care, it might actually survive. But first, he needed to survive himself. "You know, Ezra," Sheriff Caldwell continued, his voice taking on a more philosophical tone, "your Sarah was a fine woman, but she had a weakness for poking her nose into other people's business. Always asking questions, always writing things down in that little book of hers. Made some folks mighty uncomfortable with all her curiosity." The admission hit Ezra like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears about his wife's death. These men he had trusted and respected, had known about Sarah's investigation all along. They had watched her get closer to the truth, and when she became too much of a threat, they had silenced her permanently. The riding accident had been carefully staged, her body positioned in the ravine to make her death look accidental. She found out about the mining rights, didn't she? Ezra said quietly, his voice barely audible over the wind. The land deals, the disappearances, all of it. She discovered that some of you have been using the dueling line to eliminate anyone who threatened your little arrangement. Marcus Harrison's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfect for a man who claimed to make his living through honest work. Smart woman, you're Sarah. Too smart for her own good, as it turned out. She figured out that certain claims had been jumping hands in ways that weren't entirely legal, and that some of the previous owners had simply vanished when they refused to sell. The dueling line provided a convenient explanation for any bloodstains that might turn up, don't you think? The pieces began falling into place in Ezra's mind like the tumblers of a lock finally clicking open. The mining company that had been buying up land throughout the county, the families who had supposedly moved away to seek better opportunities elsewhere, the men who had challenged certain business practices only to disappear or die in accidents. It was all connected, a web of corruption and murder that stretched back years. Sarah had gotten too close to exposing the truth, so they had killed her and made it look like an accident. But somehow, this wolf had witnessed something, perhaps Sarah's actual murder or the disposal of other victims, and now it was leading him to the same fate that had befallen his wife. The animal's strange behavior, its deliberate path to this clearing, suddenly made perfect sense. It was trying to show him what had really happened here. The wind picked up, sending dead leaves swirling around the clearing like restless spirits, and in that moment, Ezra felt Sarah's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him. She had been brave enough to pursue the truth even when it put her life in danger, and now it was his turn to honor her memory by finishing what she had started. The journal hidden inside his coat contained enough evidence to bring down the entire conspiracy, but first he needed to get out of this clearing alive. The wounded wolf made a soft sound, almost like a whimper, and Ezra saw its eyes flicker toward something behind the three men. For just an instant, he glimpsed movement among the trees, a flash of gray that might have been another wolf or simply shadows playing tricks in the fading afternoon light. But the wounded animal's sudden alertness suggested that they were not alone in the dueling line, and perhaps rescue might come from an unexpected source. Time to join your wife, McKinnon, Sheriff Caldwell said, his finger tightening on the trigger. Don't worry, though. We'll make sure folks remember you as a grieving widower who couldn't live with his loss. Tragic story, really. Man follows a wounded animal into the woods and accidentally falls on his own rifle. These things happen all the time out here on the frontier. But as the sheriff prepared to fire, the wounded wolf somehow found the strength to lunge upward, its teeth sinking deep into Caldwell's gun arm. The man screamed in pain and surprise, his shot going wild as he stumbled backward, trying to shake off the determined animal. In the chaos that followed, with Deputy Barnes shouting and Marcus Harrison scrambling for his own weapon, Ezra saw his chance and took it, rolling away from the immediate danger while the wolf's sacrifice bought him precious seconds of confusion. The dust had barely settled when Ezra scrambled to his feet, heart pounding like the hooves of a wild stallion. The wolf's fierce bite had thrown Sheriff Caldwell off balance, but the man was already regaining his composure, blood streaming from the puncture wounds in his forearm while his pale eyes burned with murderous intent. Deputy Barnes was fumbling with his revolver, his young hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the weapon, but Marcus Harrison had already drawn his nickel-plated Colt and was taking careful aim. The wounded wolf lay motionless now, its yellow eyes glazing over as its life ebbed away into the frozen earth of the dueling line. Its final act of defiance had bought Ezra perhaps 10 seconds, no more, but those precious moments allowed him to roll behind the trunk of a massive blackjack oak as Harrison's first shot splintered bark inches from his head. You can't run forever, McKinnon, Harrison called out, his voice carrying that same cultured arrogance that had always grated on Ezra's nerves. This prairie stretches for miles in every direction, and we know every rock, every creek, every hiding place between here and the next county. Your wife learned that lesson the hard way. The casual mention of Sarah's murder sent rage coursing through Ezra's veins like liquid fire, but he forced himself to remain calm and think clearly. These men had the advantage of numbers and superior firepower, but they had also just confirmed what he had suspected about Sarah's death. She hadn't died in a riding accident at Willow Creek Ravine. They had murdered her here in the dueling line and then transported her body to stage the scene, making it appear as though she had fallen from her horse during an innocent ride. Ezra pressed his back against the oak's rough bark and tried to assess his options. His old Remington revolver held only 5 shots, and he had no spare ammunition with him. The 3 men could simply wait him out, taking turns to keep him pinned down while one of them circled around to get a clear shot. The winter sun was already beginning to set, and darkness would only make his situation more desperate. But as he crouched there listening to the wind whistle through the bare branches above, Ezra became aware of other sounds drifting through the clearing. Soft footfalls in the dried leaves, barely audible over the natural noise of the prairie, but too rhythmic to be random. The dying wolf had not been alone after all. Somewhere in the shadows beyond the tree line, other members of its pack were moving through the gathering dusk with the patience of natural predators. Sheriff Caldwell had wrapped his wounded arm with a dirty bandana, but the wolf's bite had been deep and he was clearly in considerable pain. His breathing had become even more labored, the consumption in his lungs combining with shock and blood loss to weaken him significantly. When he tried to reload his rifle with one good hand, he dropped several cartridges in the snow and cursed viciously. "Maybe we should head back to town," Deputy Barnes suggested nervously, his young voice cracking with fear. "Get some more men, come back in the morning when we can see what we're doing. This place gives me the shivers even in broad daylight." Harrison laughed coldly and shook his head. "We finish this now, Deputy. McKinnon has seen too much, and that journal his wife kept could ruin everything we've worked for. Besides, I have a feeling our friend behind the tree doesn't have many options left." But Harrison was wrong about Ezra's options, because at that moment Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in his memory, recalling a conversation they'd had years earlier about the old Native American trails that crisscrossed this part of Kansas. The dueling line hadn't been chosen randomly as a place for settling disputes. It sat at the intersection of several ancient paths, including one that led to a series of limestone caves where travelers had sheltered during storms for countless generations. Sarah had explored those caves during their first summer together, documenting the primitive drawings on their walls and collecting arrowheads that had been left behind by long-departed tribes. More importantly, she had told him about a narrow passage that connected the main cave to a smaller chamber with a concealed entrance near Willow Creek, almost 2 miles away. If he could reach that passage without being seen, he might be able to escape and make it back to town with the evidence needed to expose the conspiracy. The first challenge was getting out of the clearing alive. Ezra studied the positions of his 3 adversaries and noted that they had spread out to cover the most obvious escape routes, but they were all focused on the area directly around his hiding place. None of them were watching the northern edge of the clearing where a shallow depression marked the beginning of an old buffalo wallow that would provide some cover. Moving with the careful precision he had learned during his brief service in the Union Army, Ezra began crawling on his belly through the dead grass and frozen leaves. Every few yards he paused to listen, making sure his movement hadn't been detected, then continued toward the depression that represented his only hope of reaching the cave entrance unseen. The journal remained safely tucked inside his coat, its pages containing enough evidence to bring down the entire conspiracy if he could just survive long enough to share it with honest authorities. Behind him, he could hear the 3 men arguing in increasingly heated whispers. Harrison wanted to rush the oak tree and finish Ezra quickly, but Caldwell was growing weaker by the minute and Barnes was clearly having second thoughts about the entire enterprise. The young deputy had signed on to keep the peace in a frontier town, not to participate in murder and cover-ups that stretched back for years. "I never agreed to kill anyone," Barnes was saying, his voice barely audible over the wind. "When you said we needed to discourage McKinnon from asking questions, I thought you meant running him out of town or maybe roughing him up a little. This is different. This is cold-blooded murder. This is survival," Harrison replied sharply. "Do you think McKinnon is going to keep quiet about what he's learned? Do you think he's going to forget that his precious Sarah is dead because she couldn't mind her own business? He'll bring federal marshals down on us, maybe even Pinkertons, and then we'll all swing from the same rope." Sheriff Caldwell's wheezing had grown worse, and when he tried to speak, his words came out in painful gasps. "The boy's right to be worried. Too many bodies pile up, people start asking questions we can't answer. Maybe it's time to cut our losses and move on to greener pastures." But Harrison was beyond reason now, his carefully constructed facade of genteel sophistication cracking to reveal the ruthless killer beneath. "Nobody is moving anywhere until McKinnon is dead and that journal is burned to ashes. We've come too far to back down now. Ezra had reached the buffalo wallow and was making good progress toward the tree line when he heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. From somewhere behind him came the unmistakable sound of a woman's scream, high and piercing and filled with mortal terror. For one heart-stopping moment, he thought it might be Sarah's ghost crying out from beyond the grave, but then he realized the truth was far more horrifying. They had brought another victim to the dueling line, someone else who had asked too many questions or posed a threat to their criminal enterprise. Even as Ezra fought for his own life, another innocent person was about to be murdered in that cursed clearing where so many others had already died. He turned back toward the sound of the scream and saw a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Deputy Barnes was dragging a young woman across the clearing by her long brown hair while she fought desperately to escape his grasp. Ezra recognized her immediately as Emma Hartwell, the schoolteacher who had arrived in town just 6 months earlier. She was barely 20 years old, fresh from a teacher's college back east, and she had quickly earned the respect and affection of both children and parents with her dedication and gentle nature. But Emma had apparently made the same mistake as Sarah, asking questions that powerful men preferred to leave unanswered. Perhaps she had noticed irregularities in the school district's finances, or maybe she had overheard conversations that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. Whatever she had discovered, it had sealed her fate just as surely as Sarah's curiosity had sealed hers. "Please," Emma was sobbing, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I won't tell anyone what I saw. I promise. I'll leave town tonight and never come back. You'll never see me again." Harrison's response was a backhand across her face that sent her sprawling in the frozen grass. "Too late for promises, my dear. You should have minded your own business instead of snooping around the bank after hours. Did you really think no one would notice when you started copying entries from the ledgers?" So Emma had been conducting her own investigation, probably triggered by the same inconsistencies and suspicious circumstances that had drawn Sarah's attention. The young schoolteacher had discovered the financial records that documented the conspiracy's criminal activities, and now she was about to pay the ultimate price for her courage and curiosity. Ezra found himself facing an impossible choice. He could continue toward the cave entrance and probable safety, preserving Sarah's journal and his own life so that he might eventually bring the killers to justice. Or he could abandon his escape plan and try to save Emma, almost certainly dooming them both but unable to live with the knowledge that he had allowed an innocent woman to die when he might have prevented it. The decision was made for him when Emma's desperate eyes met his across the clearing. In that brief moment of connection, he saw not just her terror but also her fierce determination to survive. She reminded him so powerfully of Sarah in that instant that he knew he could never abandon her to the same fate that had befallen his wife. Ezra raised his revolver and took careful aim at Marcus Harrison, knowing that he would have only one chance to even the odds before the other men could react. The range was considerable for a handgun, perhaps 50 yards, but he had always been a decent shot and desperation lent steadiness to his hand. He squeezed the trigger gently, the way his father had taught him during hunting expeditions in his youth, and felt the familiar kick of the Remington against his palm. The bullet took Harrison high in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his nickel-plated Colt flying into the darkness beyond the clearing. The man screamed in pain and rage, clutching at his wounded shoulder while blood seeped between his fingers, but he remained on his feet and dangerous. Sheriff Caldwell tried to bring his rifle to bear on Ezra's position, but the wolf's bite had weakened his grip and the consumption had sapped his strength. When he attempted to steady the weapon against his wounded arm, the pain was too intense and his shot went wide, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the trunk of a distant oak. Deputy Barnes released Emma and drew his own revolver, but his hands were shaking so violently that he posed little immediate threat. The young man's face had gone pale with shock and horror as the full reality of what he had become involved in finally penetrated his naive understanding of frontier justice. Ezra had 4 shots remaining, 3 desperate adversaries to deal with, and an innocent woman whose life depended on his actions in the next few minutes. The wolves he had sensed earlier were definitely closer now, their presence announced by low growls that seemed to emanate from the shadows surrounding the clearing. Perhaps the scent of fresh blood was drawing them in, or perhaps they were responding to some deeper instinct that connected them to their fallen pack mate. Emma had regained her feet and was backing away from Deputy Barnes, her torn dress and disheveled appearance testimony to the struggle she had endured. But there was steel in her spine despite her obvious fear, and Ezra could see that she was evaluating her own options for escape rather than simply cowering in helpless terror. "Run," he called out to her, rising from his concealment behind the buffalo wallow. "Head for the creek and don't look back." But Emma surprised him by shaking her head and pointing towards something behind Sheriff Caldwell. "The ledger," she shouted. "There's another ledger hidden in his saddlebags. It contains records of payments to railroad officials and territorial judges. Everything you need to prove the conspiracy reaches all the way to Washington." Her revelation sent a chill through Ezra's bones as he realized the true scope of what Sarah had stumbled upon. This wasn't just a local conspiracy involving a few corrupt officials and greedy businessmen. The network of bribery and murder extended far beyond their small Kansas community, potentially involving federal authorities who were supposed to represent justice and the rule of law. Harrison had retrieved his fallen revolver with his good hand and was now advancing on Emma with murderous intent. "Shut your mouth, you meddling bitch," he snarled, his cultured facade completely abandoned in favor of raw violence. "You've caused enough trouble already." Ezra fired again, this shot catching Harrison in the leg and dropping him to one knee. The man's scream of pain echoed across the clearing, but he maintained his grip on the Colt and managed to fire a shot in Ezra's direction. The bullet came close enough that Ezra felt its wind as it passed his ear, a reminder that wounded men could still be deadly. Sheriff Caldwell was trying to reload his rifle, but his weakened condition made the process painfully slow. Blood loss from the wolf bite was taking its toll, and his face had taken on the grayish pallor that Ezra associated with men who were dying. The consumption had been eating away at his lungs for months, and the shock and exertion of the confrontation were accelerating his decline. Deputy Barnes seemed paralyzed by indecision, his revolver hanging loosely in his grip while he stared at the unfolding violence with the expression of a man whose world had suddenly turned upside down. He had joined the sheriff's department to serve his community and uphold the law, never imagining that he would find himself participating in a conspiracy that mocked everything he believed in. Emma seized the moment of confusion to dart toward Caldwell's horse, her small hands working quickly to unfasten the saddlebags that contained the additional ledger she had mentioned. The sheriff tried to stop her, but his rifle remained unloaded and he lacked the strength to pursue her effectively. The ledger Emma extracted from the saddlebags was bound in expensive leather and filled with entries written in multiple hands. Even from a distance, Ezra could see that it contained far more detailed records than Sarah's journal, documenting not just local crimes but a network of corruption that stretched across state lines and involved officials at the highest levels of territorial government. "They've been planning this for years," Emma called out, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing despite the wind. The railroad expansion, the mining claims, the territorial capital relocation, all of it coordinated to benefit a small group of investors while ordinary settlers lose everything they've worked for. Harrison fired again, this shot coming even closer to Ezra's position. The man's marksmanship remained formidable despite his wounds, and Ezra realized that he was running out of time and ammunition. He had 3 shots left in his revolver, and at least 2 of his adversaries remained capable of fighting. But as he prepared to continue the gun battle, Ezra became aware that the situation was changing in ways none of them had anticipated. The wolves he had sensed earlier were no longer hidden in the shadows but were emerging from the tree line in plain sight. There were at least 6 of them, all focused on the clearing where the scent of blood and violence hung heavy in the cold air. The pack leader was a massive gray male whose yellow eyes burned with an intelligence that reminded Ezra powerfully of the wounded wolf that had led him to this place. The animal's gaze seemed to linger on the body of its fallen pack mate before shifting to the men who had been responsible for its death. Sheriff Caldwell saw the wolves first and made a strangled sound of terror that was barely human. In his weakened condition, he would be easy prey for the pack, and his years of frontier experience had taught him to fear few things more than a coordinated wolf attack. He tried to raise his rifle, but his hands were shaking so badly that he dropped it in the snow. Deputy Barnes backed away from the approaching wolves, his revolver forgotten as primal fear overwhelmed his civilized instincts. The young man had probably never seen wolves this close before, and their predatory grace combined with obvious hostile intent was enough to reduce him to trembling panic. Harrison continued firing at Ezra, but his shots were becoming increasingly wild as blood loss and shock affected his aim. The man's earlier arrogance had given way to desperate fury, and he seemed determined to kill Ezra even if it meant dying in the attempt. Emma had managed to secure both ledgers and was now moving toward Ezra's position, using the confusion created by the wolves' arrival to cover her escape from the immediate danger. She moved with the quick, efficient grace of someone accustomed to thinking under pressure, and Ezra found himself impressed by her courage and resourcefulness. The pack leader let out a long, mournful howl that was answered by the other wolves, and the sound sent chills down Ezra's spine. It was the sound of grief and rage combined, a promise of retribution for their fallen comrade. The wolves had not come to scavenge or hunt in the conventional sense. They had come for justice. What happened next defied everything Ezra thought he knew about wolf behavior. Instead of attacking indiscriminately, the pack seemed to make deliberate choices about their targets. They ignored Emma completely and gave Ezra a wide berth, but they began circling the 3 men who had been responsible for their pack mate's death. Sheriff Caldwell tried to run, but his weakened legs betrayed him and he stumbled after only a few steps. The wolves were on him instantly, their attack swift and merciless. His screams echoed across the clearing for only a few seconds before being cut short with terrible finality. Deputy Barnes dropped his revolver and raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, but the wolves seemed to understand that he had been a reluctant participant in the violence. They surrounded him but did not attack, instead herding him toward the edge of the clearing where he could escape if he chose to abandon his criminal associates. Harrison continued shooting until his ammunition was exhausted, but the wolves were too quick and too smart to be easy targets. When his revolver clicked empty, he tried to use it as a club, but the pack leader knocked him down with a single powerful swipe of its paw. The man's cultured voice rose to a high-pitched shriek as he realized his fate. Ezra found himself transfixed by the sight of natural justice being carried out with ruthless efficiency. The wolves had somehow understood who was responsible for their pack mate's death and were exacting an appropriate penalty. It was as if the spirit of the wild had risen up to restore the balance that had been disrupted by human greed and violence. Emma reached his side just as the wolves finished with Harrison, their task completed with the same methodical precision that had marked every aspect of their intervention. The pack leader approached Ezra slowly, its massive head lowered in what looked almost like a gesture of respect or acknowledgement. For a long moment, man and wolf stared into each other's eyes, and Ezra felt a connection that transcended the boundaries between species. In the pack leader's gaze, he saw recognition of the bond he had shared with the wounded wolf, an understanding that they had both lost something precious to the violence that had stained this place. Then the wolves were gone, melting back into the shadows as silently as they had emerged. Deputy Barnes had fled as well, running toward town with the panic-driven speed of a man who had seen more than his sanity could bear. Only Ezra and Emma remained in the clearing, surrounded by the evidence of the conspiracy that had cost so many lives. Emma handed him the ledger from Caldwell's saddlebags, her hands still shaking from the ordeal she had endured. "We need to get this to someone in authority," she said quietly. "Someone who wasn't involved in the conspiracy. The records go back almost 10 years and implicate dozens of officials across 3 territories." Ezra nodded and carefully placed the ledger inside his coat next to Sarah's journal. Between the 2 documents, they had enough evidence to expose the entire network and ensure that justice was served for all the innocent people who had died to protect these secrets. As they prepared to leave the dueling line, Ezra took one final look at the body of the wolf that had sacrificed itself to save his life. The animal's yellow eyes had closed, but its expression seemed peaceful now, as if it had found the rest that had been denied to it in life. He whispered a prayer of gratitude for the creature's courage and dedication, knowing that he would never forget the debt he owed to its sacrifice. The journey back to town passed in relative silence, both survivors lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed and endured. Emma had revealed that her investigation into the school district's finances had uncovered irregularities that led her to suspect broader corruption, but she had never imagined the scope of the conspiracy or the lengths to which its participants would go to protect their secrets. When they reached the outskirts of town, Ezra made a decision that would have profound consequences for both their futures. Instead of going to the local authorities, who might still include conspiracy members they hadn't identified, he suggested that they travel to the territorial capital and present their evidence directly to federal officials who were beyond the reach of local corruption. Emma agreed without hesitation, recognizing that their lives would remain in danger as long as any part of the conspiracy remained intact. They spent the next 3 days gathering supplies and preparing for the journey, during which time Deputy Barnes disappeared completely, presumably fleeing to avoid prosecution for his role in the criminal enterprise. The presentation of their evidence to territorial authorities created a sensation that reverberated all the way to Washington. Federal marshals descended on their county like an avenging army, armed with warrants and backed by the full power of the United States government. The conspiracy that had seemed so invulnerable was dismantled piece by piece, its participants arrested and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. In the months that followed, Ezra found that his grief over Sarah's death had begun to transform into something resembling peace. He had fulfilled the promise he made to her memory, ensuring that her sacrifice had not been in vain and that the truth she had died seeking was finally brought to light. The process of healing was slow and difficult, but it was aided by his growing friendship with Emma, whose own courage and determination reminded him that life still held possibilities for joy and renewal. The dueling line was eventually reclaimed by the prairie, its blood-soaked earth covered by new growth that seemed to wash away the stains of old violence. Ezra visited the site only once more, on the anniversary of Sarah's death, and found it peaceful in a way that would have been impossible before justice was served. As he stood in the clearing where so much had been lost and finally restored, Ezra heard the distant howl of wolves calling to each other across the vast Kansas prairie. The sound no longer filled him with dread but with a sense of connection to something larger than human concerns, a reminder that justice could take many forms and that the natural world had its own ways of restoring balance to a broken world. The wounded wolf had led him not just to the truth about Sarah's death but to a deeper understanding of his own capacity for courage and redemption. In following that dying animal to the dueling line, he had discovered that even in the darkest places, it was possible to find light, and that the bonds between all living things were stronger than the forces that sought to destroy them.